But since my book sort of germinated at a time when Nelson Mandela was ill and then eventually died, and his ideas played a central role in my thinking even before his death, let me conclude with that, I think, very important example. So I've argued that anger leads down two paths, each of which has an unattractive error built into it. Either anger's wish for ill to befall the wrongdoer is empty because payback doesn't do any good for the important elements of human flourishing that have been damaged, or it remains narrowly focused on relative status, in which case it may possibly succeed in its aim, relative abasement, but the aim itself is singularly unworthy. I'll now argue that Mandela himself comes intuitively to the same conclusion, in a way informed by his study of Gandhi, but much more shaped by his own life experience and his long period of self-examination during his 27 years in prison, a time that he says was extremely productive in meditating about anger. And we recently found out that there was a manuscript of Marcus Aurelius's meditations in the prison on Robben Island, smuggled in by Ahmad Kathrada, the Indian inmate who was with Mandela. And Mandela later alludes to that case, but now we know that he could have been reading it while he was meditating about anger. So what did Mandela realize in those long hours of what he later calls Conversations with Myself, the title of a book of letters and interviews in which he deliberately compares his experience to the meditations of Marcus Aurelius? First, he says, he recognized that obsession with status is ubiquitous but unworthy, and so he refuses to go down that road, although he uses his understanding of that error to relate to other people. As for the wish for payback, he says he understands it all too well and feels it deeply in his own life, but he recognized, he tells us, that payback simply doesn't get you anywhere. Maybe at some level you've got a choice between anger and non-anger in the sense that wrongdoing might understandably and humanly ground either response. But if we ponder the sheer futility of the payback tendency, and if we actually want good for ourselves and for others, we quickly discover that non-anger and a generous disposition are far more useful. Above all, says Mandela, they're more useful for the person who's the fiduciary of a nation. To put it in a nutshell, a responsible leader has to be a pragmatist, and anger is incompatible with forward-looking pragmatism. It just gets in the way. A good leader must move to the transition, to use my lingo, as rapidly as possible, and perhaps for much of his life just stay there. A good summary of Mandela's approach can be found in a little parable that he told to his interviewer, Richard Stengel, and he said it was one he often used with his followers. I told the incident of an argument between the sun and the wind, that the sun said, "I'm stronger than you are," and the wind said, "No, I'm stronger than you are." And they decided, therefore, to test their strength with a traveler who was wearing a blanket. And they agreed that the one who would succeed in getting the traveler to get rid of the blanket would be the stronger. So the wind started. It started blowing, and the harder it blew, the tighter the traveler pulled his blanket around his body. And the wind blew and blew, but it could not get him to discard the blanket. And as I said, the harder the wind blew, the tighter the visitor tried to hold the blanket around his body. And the wind eventually gave up. Then the sun started with its rays, very mild, and they increased in strength, and as they increased, the traveler felt that the blanket was unnecessary, because the blanket is for warmth. So he decided to relax it, to loosen it, but the rays of the sun became stronger and stronger, and eventually he threw it away. So, by a gentle method, it was possible to get the traveler to discard his blanket. And this is the parable, that through peace, you will be able to convert, you see, the most determined people, and this is the method we should follow. Now, significantly, Mandela frames the entire question in forward-looking pragmatic terms as a question of getting the other party to do what you want. He then shows that this task is much more feasible if you can get the other party to sort of trust you, work with you, rather than against you. Progress is impeded by the other party's defensiveness and anxious self-protection. Anger, consequently, does nothing to move matters forward. It just increases the other party's anxiety. A gentle approach, by contrast, can gradually weaken defenses until the whole idea of self-defense is given up. Mandela, of course, was neither naive nor so ideological as to refuse reality, so we would never, I think, have found him proposing, as I'm afraid Gandhi did, to drop armed resistance to Hitler or to try converting Hitler by friendship and charm. His parable is offered in a particular context, that of the ending of a sometimes violent liberation struggle with people on the other side, many of whom are genuine patriots, who wish the future good of the nation. He insisted from the start that nonviolence should be used only strategically. Still, behind even the strategic resort to violence was always a view of people that was transitional, focused not on payback, but on the creation of a shared and cooperative future in the wake of outrageous and terrible deeds. Two famous examples show Mandela checking the demands of his own ANC buddies for payback in the service of reconciliation. The first is the example of rugby, known from the movie Invictus with Morgan Freeman as Mandela, based in turn on John Carlin's book of the same name, which is actually better than the movie because it has a lot more history in it. So the story is that the ANC had voted to decertify the rugby team as an official team of the nation in an attempt to punish the racist white rugby community because it had been an almost exclusively white sport, and most of those people were really quite racist. But Mandela understood the strategic importance of sports for national reconciliation, and he set out to form a friendship with the team's captain and the other players, in the process also getting them to offer rugby clinics in the townships so that it rapidly became a much less all-white sport. The celebration of the World Cup victory was the culmination of this long strategic campaign. And when the huge crowd, and this is before they won, when the huge crowd in unison in the stadium chanted Mandela's name, the future of the nation was one big step further on. The second related example I'll give you was that of the national anthem. The ANC had voted to substitute their freedom anthem, Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, for the old Afrikaans anthem, Die Stem. Mandela saw that this would impede a future of reconciliation. So, in fact, he had learned fluent Afrikaans during his time in prison. So he proposed and convinced his party to accept the version that is now sung, in which the two anthems are put together. In fact, Nkosi is sung in 4 different African languages. Then we have the stanza in Afrikaans, and then there's a final stanza in English. In both of these cases, payback was very natural and very easy. Mandela preferred a more devious and difficult course. Although the ANC thought that their self-respect required payback, they later saw that a generous spirit was both self-respecting and far more useful for the nation. So let me end this lecture with just one more Mandela story, which shows him renouncing both the status error and the payback error. So here Mandela is talking to Richard Stengel about an interaction he had with a white Afrikaner jailer or warder who watched him while he was in the transitional prison Victor Vorster just prior to his official release. So basically he was in 3 different prisons for a very long period of time, like 26 years. He was in this Robben Island where the conditions were really harsh. Then after that, when it was already clear that he was probably going to be the leader of the country, he was in one that was much less bad on the mainland called Pollsmoor. And then, when he had already been basically elected as president and he was about to be released, he was in this one called Victor Vorster, which was a kind of country club prison where he had his own suite and a personal cook and so on. So the person we're talking about is the jailer who was his personal cook. And the question was how the dishes would get done, a question in many households all over the world. I took it upon myself to break the tension and a possible resentment on his part that he has to serve a prisoner by cooking and then washing dishes. And I offered to wash the dishes myself. And he refused. He said, "This is his work." I said, "No, we must share it." Although he insisted and he was genuine, I forced him, literally forced him, to allow me to do the dishes. And we established a very good relationship. A really nice chap, Warder Svart, a very good friend of mine. Now, it would have been so easy to see the situation as one of status inversion. The dominating Afrikaner is doing dishes for the once despised ANC leader. It would also have been very easy to see it in terms of payback. The warder is getting a humiliation he deserves because of his complicity in racial oppression. Significantly, Mandela doesn't go down either of these doomed paths, even briefly. He asks only, how shall I produce cooperation and friendship? It was this remarkable capacity for generosity and reciprocity that was Mandela's genius, the fruit, as he tells us, of years of critical self-examination on Robben Island. It's a difficult goal, but it's that goal that I'm recommending for both individuals and institutions. Anger is a prominent part of most people's lives. I've argued that it lacks the virtues often claimed for it and has both normative and practical problems all its own. I hesitate to conclude with a slogan that certainly betrays my age, but it really does seem time to give peace a chance. Yes.